G'day, this is Rodney from Trix Circus, and we are at CK Academy where we're going to show you how to install one of our acrobatic beam clamps. When you receive the beam clamp, it will be assembled in a separate situation with all the bolts and all the different pieces, and the tools that you'll need in order to do this installation are all set up over here. You will get an individual picture with each part labeled, so you'll know what to expect when you start the installation. We have the beam, which is conveniently low today to show you how to do the installation, and we will go from here as to the process in a step-by-step form of how to do the installation safely. During your installation, you might consider using a scissor lift rather than a ladder in order to reach the beam that you are rigging from. The reason for this is that the beam clamps weigh 11 kilograms each, which means that it's reasonably heavy to maneuver by one hand. So if you also choose to use a extension ladder, we recommend that you obviously tie the extension ladder to the beam that you're working on, and your own safety will go around the beam as well, so that you feel secure. You will be needing to leave the extension ladder to get around the other side of the beam and get back onto it, so that is the reason why you have to secure it really well and make sure that your lanyard is on the beam itself. Riggers should always work in pairs. Today, my second rigger is Sonia Rakowska. She's also an advanced rigger with an Australian certification, and we will be helping each other to set this beam clamp up on this beam safely and securely.
So the reason we send second rigger out on jobs is not only to assist, it's also to have a second pair of eyes, which is very important, and a second pair of hands.
Okay, we're going to start to put the beam clamp together in the way it should be used. We'll start off using the connecting bolt, which connects the two side plates to each other. It's a 12mm bolt, it's 60mm long, a washer on each side. Place it through. There's only one pair of holes that's big enough to fit this, and you will do one on each side. When you receive your beam clamp in the mail, it will be these bolts and nuts will already be put together in this way, but they would not have been tightened because we're using a nylock nut that is going to be used on this system. And now we just tighten it up using a ratchet. If you want to use a power tool to do this part, you're welcome to do that. But once you put this together, you will not need to take the nylock nut off and separate it. Alright, as soon as we've done this second bolt up and the clamp is tight, make sure that they're firm. Make sure that they're nice and firm. And now you've got the unit together nice and smooth and flat on the ends, and all the holes should line up as well as possible. If you find that the holes do not line up perfectly, this is the time that you can loosen them off just gently, making sure that the shackle pin that is going to go through those holes can indeed go through them smoothly. We will need a shackle for this, Sonia. So I've just loosened that off a little bit, just to give the plates some movement in each other. We will use a 2-ton shackle. The dimensions of the 2-ton shackle has been measured to fit perfectly around the sides of the flanges of the beam clamp, and the pin needs to go through the hole smoothly without it binding, so that it can turn easily and function normally as a shackle should function. So if you like, you can start off with this process by having a shackle in place. That way, when you do tighten the bolts that are keeping the beam clamps together, we know that the holes are completely aligned up and there shouldn't be a problem once you get up onto the beam that you're installing on. Alright, and the shackle can move freely and we're ready to go. Before we take the beam clamp up to the beam, we want to do a preparation which is very handy for the actual installation part of it. And that is to attach one of the side or top flanges to the beam. In order to, our flanges come with 2 spaces on each side. The spaces are designed to fit the size flange on the universal beam that you are installing this on. So you're going to need to know that thickness before you choose what size spacer to use. In this case, the beam that we are working on has got a 7mm flange. We have the smaller spacer in place, and that spacer will then be placed on top of the beam clamp. The beam clamp will sit like this. It will sit on top of the beam clamp, and we'll attach the 2 bolts and get it prepared so that we can place this on the very first thing we'll do once we get up there. We're going to use the most convenient way to set this up in the beginning is just to have the flange or the top flange on one side on the ground so that the ground is supporting the weight of it, and you put and start preparing the bolts in place. We do the same thing on the other side. Now these bolts and holes are all engineered and they're all in exactly the right place they need to be for this installation. We will need to change the size of our spanner now to the larger size. Sonia, do you mind giving me the 25, please? So we got a 24mm socket and same size of the wrench, and we're basically going to tighten that. And we're not going to tighten it all the way. We have to leave space for the beam flange, but we just want to make it tight enough that once we put it in place, it's not going to fall down and we don't have to hold it all the time while we put the other side on. Once you have placed the first top part in place, we've got enough space for the beam flange to fit in there. We are now ready to start the installation up on the high beam. We prepare the second top section as we've had with the first. We're just getting the bolts prepared, so once this is in place, we'll just be able to slide this in the correct position and slide the bolts through and tighten them, and before we finish the final part of the install. Okay. Before we go up onto the beam to do the actual installation, we need to start by preparing our space with markings so that we can put it in exactly the right place we want it to be in. On top of which, we need to mark our beam clamp itself to make sure it's sitting completely central to the beam itself. It might seem that it's unnecessary to do this, but once you're up there, it's much harder to start fiddling to get the beam completely square or the beam clamp completely square, and it's much better to do it in advance so that it's all set like a little template for the beam clamp. We're starting to mark the beam clamp, so we're just measuring the length of the beam clamp and putting a central mark there. So with the tape measure, I'll help Sonia. This is the beam clamp is 30 centimeters or 300 millimeters long. We choose the 150 millimeter mark or 15 centimeter mark and make a mark there, and we will repeat the same on the other side. We know that it's 300 or 30 mil. There we go. And so now we found the center point there. We already know that the center point is the middle of the two sides of the beam clamp, and so we don't have to measure that. Now let's go up onto the beam. Alright, we have a rigging design that tells us where the beam clamp should be on the beam. So following those instructions, we're going to now measure 1.5 meters from the end of the beam to the point that the beam clamp should sit. We make our first measurement, which will be the middle of the beam clamp. The second two measurements are 10 centimeters on either side to get the total width of the beam clamp. And then we will then use the set square to find the middle of the beam and make a measurement there. Once we've established what point in the beam we're going to set the beam clamp, we now have to start marking the actual beam so that it works as a template for our beam clamp to fit. We measure the total width of the flange of the beam. In this case, it's 125 millimeters. So we want to find the center point, divide that by 2, it's 62.5, and we're now going to make that measurement in the place on each flange end. We're now going to use a set square to make as accurate measurements on the beam, and it's much safer or better to look from underneath the beam to avoid parallax error so that you can get the squareness of the beam clamp ensured. Both sides.
Oh, yeah. That would help.
Alright, once we're satisfied with the marks, now we are ready to start the installation with the actual beam clamp. We're now going to start the preparation of putting the beam clamp in place. The first top flange that we're using on the beam clamp will be slid over the lower flange of the beam. We've set it up to a height which makes it just big enough to slide over, and once it's on, it will not fall off on its own. However, we still need to safety the beam clamp before we start to do anything else. Once the beam clamp has been put in place, we're now going to safety it using a little 1-ton ratchet. Put the 1-ton ratchet on opposite sides of the top flange. Make sure you go over the end of the beam clamp. We use the 2-ton chuckle as a locator in this case. And now we're just going to thread the ratchet through the ratchet strap through the handle and get ready to tighten it, making sure that it goes right over the front end of the ratchet as well. And now we've got it to a place that we can leave it alone without it falling down, and we can continue our work safely. It's now time to put the second top flange on for our beam clamp. It'll go through I'll keep it under the safety. The 2 bolts will go through the slot holes already prepared, and you can set the 2 screws in place. Now we're going to use tools that you've already prepared with the large enough socket wrench and the top wrench, and we're going to start to tighten these bolts until we can nip it tight enough and start aligning our beam clamp with our marks. track all the time. Really busy these things, but
So that's on the wrong way.
yeah.
Okay. Bit more.
So it's just, we just need to go back onto this mark. Okay, so we're going to go. Yeah. Once we put that flange on, we still have some movement in the bolts. You don't put it on too tightly because we have to still maneuver the whole beam clamp around. We're going to now tighten the other side flange to make sure that we have minimal movement in it.
You're doing this one.
At this point, our beam clamp is very safe, it will not fall off. So the next part we can do is readjust our safety so that it's not actually interfering with us being able to move the beam clamp easily. We're now going to ensure that the two top flanges stay located right up with the bolts against the flange of the universal beam. And we're going to use a flat carpenter's G-clamp for that. It's not going to take a lot of weight, it's purely here as a locator. So we're going to place one jaw on each side of the top flanges, trying to get it as close to the center of the flange as possible. And then we just tighten it up, which is going to bring the two top flanges flush against the bottom flange of the beam that we're working on. This also serves to keep the beam in place, the beam clamp in place. Okay, so that's tight enough and our two top flanges are in place, leaving us free to be able to maneuver the bottom part of the clamp reasonably easily. If it's still sticky, you could always just loosen some of those nuts just a little bit. We're now at the final phase of our beam installation. We are going to use a torque wrench for this purpose. We're using the same size socket that we were using before on the nuts for the 60mm bolts. And we need to set the torque wrench to the correct tension. In this case, our engineering information is that we have to set it at 90. If you know how to use a torque wrench, you will then adjust the tension of the torque wrench to 90. It's not that easy to see, so you have to be very careful with what it looks like. And if you can see very carefully, there's the 90 there, and I have to turn the top of this up until it reaches that line. And once it's reached that line, it's now at the correct tension required by the engineer for tightening these beams. So let me just look at it. When you hear the click in the torque wrench, you know it's reached its maximum tension, and when you do not need to tighten it any more than that. Once you've done all 4 bolts to the correct tension, we're going to remove the clamp, the carpenter's clamp, G-clamp, and we're going to remove the safety, and then we're going to replace the safety with another safety rope which will stay there permanently. Okay, on down. Okay, we're now going to do witness marks on the beam clamp to make sure that it does not move. If for future inspections, they'll need these marks to check that. So we just do a circumference around the top flange, all the way along, making sure that you do it as neatly and as clean as possible. And then we're going to do along the edge of the bottom flange. We already have a mark there, but we'll just confirm that by adding this mark. We'll do it all the way around where our beam clamp joins the bottom of the actual beam that we're working on. At this point, we're ready to actually hang the gear off our beam clamp. We already have our 2-ton shackle in place. It's time to remove that if necessary. And for instance, we might want to hang a swivel on the bottom of this before we put it in place. There could also be a omni pulley block of some sort if we're using a pulley system. Nonetheless, you'll then replace the 2-ton shackle with your gear hanging on it. And remember to always put a mouse on to your shackle pin. We use a cable tie to mouse off the shackle, and to neaten it up, we'll just cut most of the tail off so that it's nice and firm. And we will then use the carabiner to attach to the shackle and set our other gear. We're still not finished. We have one more safety to do, and that is a safety for the beam clamp and very possibly for the gear that we're using. We're now going to use a double braided rope as our safety for the beam clamp and for any gear that's hanging underneath here. Once we know the sizes and dimensions of the actual beam, we can then use that calculation to how much rope we need. I've preset this amount of rope for this beam. We bring it around. We are now going to thread the end of the rope through one of the holes on the beam clamp. We have 4 holes for the beam clamp. The 2 middle ones are for the actual main loading of the rigging, and these other holes here on the sides are for runners or for things like this for the safety. If you have a shackle and a pulley with a pulley system on there, you will leave enough slack in this before you started to make your tie off. So you'll leave some slack in this completely. You will then tie the other end of the rope to the first end, which I preset with a loop. And once you're satisfied that the knot you've tied is safe and strong, you will then maneuver it around so it sits on top of the beam, out of the way, making sure that it doesn't interfere with any of the rigging underneath and the safety of the user on the apparatus. Alright, thank you for watching this installation video. I hope that it makes sense to you. We will be giving some written notes on the same installation so that you can see and follow those instructions very carefully.
Thank you.
From Trix Circus family, bye.